In chess, the most dangerous attacks aren't always the most obvious. Sometimes the most powerful attacks are the ones you cannot immediately see, and it takes creativity and imagination to spot these hidden attacking opportunities. That's exactly what Grandmaster Vladimir Simagin manages to do in today's game, and I'll challenge you to pause the video in critical positions and discover the hidden routes that lead to the enemy king. So let's dive in. Simagin's opponent, Ravinsky, starts with e4 and Simagin plays the Sicilian defense. After knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6 and knight c3, Simagin goes for the dragon variation, which usually leads to a very sharp middle game. Black is going to fianchetto the bishop, putting pressure on white's queenside and taking under control the important central squares. However, by playing g6, black has also weakened his kingside, and this lets white carry out very dangerous pawn storms on the kingside. And the most aggressive and popular variation arises after bishop e3, bishop g7 and f3. By playing f3, white reinforces the central pawn, takes under control the g4 square, preventing the possible knight g4, which would have harassed the valuable dark squared bishop, after which white is going to play queen d2, creating the queen and bishop battery, opening way for his king to the queenside, and after castling queenside, white is going to start his powerful and dangerous pawn storm on the kingside. His bishop will also be ready to invade h6 to exchange itself for the black's valuable bishop, while black in his turn tries to create counterplay on the queenside, as his bishop is directed towards this side of the board and he also has the half-open c-file on the queenside. But all this didn't happen in our game, because instead of this sharp variation, white goes for a quieter classical system. He plays bishop e2. Instead of castling queenside, he's going to castle kingside, and instead of the h4, h5 advance, he's going to expand on the kingside with f4, trying to create threats to the black king. After bishop g7, both sides castle, and only now bishop e3. So before pushing the f-pawn forward, white has harmoniously developed his minor pieces. And Simagin develops his queen's knight. Now white has different options. He can, of course, play f4 right away, which looks like the most natural move. However, in this case, black has a sharp continuation, queen b6, creating two threats. The first one is obvious, queen takes b2, and the second one, as by playing queen b6, black has put more pressure on the d4 knight. It is attacked 2 times and it's defended only 2 times. Black is also threatening to capture the e4 pawn with the discovered attack, the third attack on the d4 knight, and this leads to a very sharp tactical battle. The second option, besides f4, is queen d2. Developing the queen, defending the knight, the bishop, creating the queen and bishop battery. Now, of course, queen b6 doesn't make any sense, because it runs into knight f5, with the discovered attack on the black queen and also attack on the valuable bishop. But in this case, instead of queen b6, black can break in the center with d5. And after this liberating break, black destroys white's center and almost equalizes. For this reason, white goes for the third option. In order to prevent the possible d5 break, white moves his knight away from the queen's way. Now the queen, together with the pawn and the knight, controls this square, making the d5 advance impossible. But Simagin insists on this break. He plays bishop e6, taking the d5 square under control. Now black again is ready to push the d-pawn forward. But white starts his expansion on the king side with f4, also preventing the d5 advance. Now that the white pawn is on f4, d5 runs into f5, after which black has an unpleasant choice, either to capture on f5, after which his pawn structure on the king side will be demolished, or to retreat the bishop, after which the pawn will not be defended by the bishop anymore and white simply wins this pawn. For this reason, as the d5 break doesn't work, Simagin develops his rook, putting pressure on the c-file and in particular on the knight, which is the only defender of the e4 pawn. and preparing the ground for the exchange sacrifice, which will later become standard in the Sicilian defense. White continues his expansion, f5, with a tempo. However, this advance has a serious drawback. It permanently weakens the e5 square and the black knight will be greatly placed on this square. But at the moment, black must save his bishop, so he retreats to d7. And white continues his expansion, g4. At first sight, it might seem that black's position is critical. White is threatening to push the g-pawn to g5 with a tempo, attacking the knight, kicking it out from the active square, after which the knight will be forced to retreat to the passive e8 square. However, black's position actually isn't critical at all, because white has played too aggressively, and Simagin will punish him for that. So he plays knight e5, centralizing his knight and, which is very important, opening the rook's file. And it turns out that if white makes the intended move g5, instead of retreating to e8, black can sacrifice the exchange. Rook takes c3. And it's important that the bishop isn't defended either. So after this sacrifice, white has an unpleasant option. Either to accept the exchange sacrifice, after which, instead of retreating to e8, black will, of course, capture the valuable central pawn. So for this exchange, he has a pawn, so white has only minimal material advantage, but positionally, black is much better. He has very active pieces. White's king is exposed. His pawns are far advanced and it isn't clear what they are doing. White doesn't have any prospects of attack on the king side anymore. His queen side is demolished and c3 is under attack, f5 is under attack, black is much better. Or, after possible g5 and rook takes c3, if instead of accepting the sacrifice, white captures the knight, attacking the bishop, then the e3 bishop isn't defended, so the rook can capture it. And after f takes g, king takes g7, it turns out that black is simply up a pawn, and positionally he is much better. He has a great knight, the e4 pawn is under attack, white's king side is destroyed, so black is much better. For this reason, instead of g5, in the anticipation of the exchange sacrifice on c3, white plays bishop d4. On the one hand, moving the bishop away from e3, now after possible rook takes c3, the bishop will not fall under attack. On the other hand, besides that, another idea behind bishop d4 is to reinforce the knight. And it might seem that white has prevented the exchange sacrifice. But it isn't the case, because Simagin still plays it. Rook takes c3. It might seem that now that white moved his bishop to d4, it would make more sense to capture the rook with the bishop in order to keep the pawn structure intact. But it isn't the case, because knight takes e4 would come with a tempo. Black would threaten to capture on c3, eliminating the valuable bishop, after which the dark squares in white's position will be terribly weakened. Besides that, after knight takes c3, b takes c, again white's pawn structure will be demolished, so white would be forced to spend a tempo to prevent all this by playing bishop d4. But after e6, black would threaten to capture on f5 and also open his queen's way. And in order to save his pawn, white must capture, but after bishop takes e6, all black pieces are very active. The weak g4 pawn falls under attack. The white queen is ready to be transferred to the king side, after which g4 would be attacked for the third time, so black is much better. For this reason, instead of capturing the rook with the bishop, white captures with the pawn. And now knight takes e4 comes without a tempo at least, so the bishop doesn't fall under attack as it isn't on c3, and the pawn on c3 is defended by the centralized bishop. The black knight is very active, while the white knight is passive. It isn't doing anything on b3, it's restricted by the d6 pawn, so white decides to exchange his passive knight for the great black knight. And that's exactly what happens. Simagin exchanges the knights. And then he activates his bishop, taking the exposed long diagonal under control. And now we can look at the results of the exchange sacrifice. For the exchange, black has a pawn, white's king side is demolished, his king is exposed, his pawns are weak, these far advanced pawns, white doesn't have prospects of attack on the king side, and his queen side is demolished. Besides that, black is ready to play queen a5, queen d5. And after this maneuver, he will create the queen and bishop battery, threatening checkmate on g2, and if white defends against the checkmate, the queen from d5 can also invade h1, which is also very unpleasant. So, to prevent this queen maneuver, queen a5 and queen d5, white plays c4, taking the a5 square under control. So, Simagin develops his queen on c7, and white develops the rook, occupying the half-open file and moving the rook away from the potential attack on of the black bishop. And we have reached the first critical position. It's clear that black has very good compensation for the exchange. His pieces are very active. But how to increase the pressure and create deadly threats to the enemy king? With his next move, Simagin discovers the first hidden route that leads to the enemy king. And you can pause the video and try to discover this hidden attacking idea too. So, the black minor pieces are very active. The bishop is greatly placed on the long diagonal. However, the lonely bishop cannot create checkmating threats to the white king. So, the black queen is passive. If only black could place his queen in front of the bishop and create the queen and bishop battery. So, white has prevented queen a5, queen d5 maneuver, but Simagin finds a hidden way, another way of doing that. He plays b6. The idea is to retreat the bishop either to b7 or to a8, vacating the c6 square for the queen, after which, again, he will threaten checkmate on g2 or the invasion on h1. So, white must do something about this terrible threat. But white's problem is that he cannot actually challenge black on the long diagonal. He cannot play bishop f3 because this square is controlled by the knight. And if white removes the knight in order to play bishop f3, then after bishop takes e5, black gets a great centralized bishop, which puts pressure on both the king side and the queen side. Besides that, white still cannot play bishop f3 because the bishop from e2 was defending the pawn, and after bishop takes f3, rook takes f3, black gets the second pawn for the exchange, so black already has material advantage. Besides his positional advantage, besides that, he will get more material because g4, a2 are under attack. After rook c8, c2 will also fall under attack, and black is winning. For this reason, as there is no way white can prevent black from creating his queen and bishop battery, white starts to defend the g2 and h1 squares in the anticipation of this creation of this battery. So he plays rook f2 first, defending the g2 square. Bishop a8 follows, of course. Now black is ready to play queen c6, threatening checkmate on h1 this time. That's why white plays h3. And now, of course, it was possible to play queen c6. It looks like the most natural move, threatening checkmate on h1, but white prepared king h2, and the h1 square would be defended by the second rook. And that means the pressure black creates after queen c6 isn't sufficient. And black needs to find additional attacking resource to increase the pressure on the enemy king even more. So you can pause the video one more time and try to discover the second invisible route that leads to the enemy king. So the black minor pieces are still as active as possible. The black queen is also ready to move to c6. The only black piece which isn't doing anything is the rook. And Simagin finds an original way of bringing this rook into the attack. So it's hard to imagine, but this rook will play a crucial role, because Simagin makes a counterintuitive move, g takes f, which at first sight doesn't make any sense. Black voluntarily destroys his own kingside. But it isn't dangerous at all, because white simply doesn't have sufficient attacking resources to create threats to the black king. And the idea behind g takes f is to open the g-file for the rook. And white cannot keep the g-file closed. In order to keep this file closed, he must capture with the rook, but it doesn't work, because the rook must defend the g2 square. If white captures on f5 with the rook, g2 wouldn't be defended. After queen c6, black would threaten both checkmate on g2 and also invasion on h1, and white cannot defend against both of these threats. So, after Simagin captures on f5, white must recapture with the pawn. But now, as you see, the g-file is open for the rook, and Simagin moves his king to the corner of the board, vacating the g8 square for the rook. In the anticipation of terrible rook g8 and terrible queen c6, white moves his king away from the g-file and also defends the h1 square. And of course, rook g8 follows. In order to challenge the black rook on the g-file, white plays rook g1. And only now, finally, Simagin creates his battery. And now all his pieces are as active as possible. Besides that, black has a threat. He's ready to play bishop f6, opening the g-file, which will lead to the exchange of the rooks. And after the disappearance of the g1 rook, h1 square wouldn't be defended. And that means white would be forced to defend this square with the queen and place his queen on the first rank, and the queen would play a purely defensive role and she would be almost out of play, and the rook would also remain passive, and while black will combine his threats to the white king on the long diagonal with the attack of the weak and defenseless pawns of the queen side. So one by one these pawns would fall, black would get the material advantage and would retain his great positional advantage. So to prevent all this, to prevent the exchange of the rooks, after which his queen would be passive, white plays queen g5, preventing bishop f6, pinning the bishop. Of course, that would run into checkmate in 1. But Simagin centralizes his queen now, queen e4, invading the heart of white's position and creating two threats. The first one is obvious, the dark squared bishop is under attack, but it turns out that the light squared bishop is also under attack. For example, if white defends his dark squared bishop, Simagin prepared queen takes e2, temporarily sacrificing the queen in order to deflect the rook from the f2 square, on which this rook defends the f3 square. And after white accepts the sacrifice, knight f3 check with a fork would follow, black would get the queen back and would get a big material advantage. For the rook, he would have two minor pieces. Besides that, he has an extra pawn. For this reason, in order to parry both of these threats, in order to save both of his bishops, white plays bishop e3, saving the dark squared bishop and closing the queen's way that leads to the light squared bishop. However, this runs into a spectacular combination, a final blow that wins the game on the spot. And you can pause the video and try to find it. On the d4 square, the white bishop controlled the e5 square, but now it doesn't. Besides that, there is an unpleasant x-ray on the g-file. And Simagin exploits this. He sacrifices the knight, knight g4 check, with a tempo vacating the e5 square for the bishop. And no matter how white captures the knight, let's say he captures with the pawn, the reply would be the same. Bishop e5 check with the discovered attack on the white queen. And after possible king h3, Black captures the queen. It's true, after bishop takes g5, materially the position is more or less equal. For the queen, white has 2 rooks. However, positionally, white's position is hopeless. Just compare the coordination of the pieces. The great black pieces, the white king is in trouble, and the useless white, miserable white rooks, which aren't doing anything, the terrible bishop, which is restricted by its own pawns, and besides that the c2 pawn falls. Black is threatening queen c3 check, continue his attack after that. For example, after bishop takes e7, queen c3 check, black creates terrible threats. He is threatening queen h6 checkmate. Besides that, the rook is under attack. For this reason, after knight g4 check, white resigned. And now I recommend watching how Simagin executes the most aggressive opening strategy against none other than the legendary Viktor Korchnoi. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.